We've got a wonderful day ahead of us, and I just want to start by saying a few thank yous and a few welcomes, and then we'll get right into it. First of all, Design Week. This is our 7th, as I understand it. So it's a tradition that's been going on in the department for some time, and the Design Week has always focused on a particular project or a particular thought piece, and this year's is on the White River in Muncie. The funding for Design Week is being provided by a partnership. Browning Day Mullins Deerdorf and Bart Hendrickson is here, and Larry Rohn is here. Just wave there. And thank you very much. Round of applause. And it's also being supported through the foundation, through the enhancement fees, and through the speaker series. So we have a really robust partnership in the funding of this year's event. And I'd like to just take a few seconds to introduce Pliny. We have 3 presentations today. Because these are being webcast out to the world, it would be necessary for all questions to be stated through this double mic thing. One is why you all can hear it, and the other is why the people in cyberspace can hear it. So if you have a question, please talk through these so that it can be recorded. Pliny was here some years ago on the faculty. So this is old stomping grounds for him. He's the co-founder and co-director of the Center for Maximum Potential Building Systems, which is an educational research and demonstration facility, nonprofit, in Austin, Texas. They have been specializing in life cycle planning and design for over 30 years, and he and his partner Gail have probably been 2 of the most influential people in the green building movement in the United States. The center engages in projects that are based on their potential contribution to sustainability and human health at all scales. They collaborate with other organizations, businesses, and professional firms. I've had the pleasure of working with Pliny twice in my life. Once when we didn't know each other at all. I was working in Iran, and he was working in Philadelphia on a project that Ian McHarg had created with the government of Iran at the time, called the Partisan Project, which was a recreation of the entire global ecosystems in one massive park. Years later, I bumped into Pliny as a co-faculty person at Texas A&M and mentioned someone who was very dear to me in that project, Narendra Juneja. It was when Pliny and I saw how both of us felt about Narendra that we realized we had some work together. We've since collaborated on some projects in hurricane recovery and urban design studios, and now Design Week. Fortunately, John Motloch has been in the mix. He's on the faculty here, and I'd like to introduce him now to introduce Pliny. Thank you very much for coming, and here's John.
Thank you, Jody. It's funny, as I heard Jody say that, at the same time that she and Pliny were meeting over the Partisan Project in Tehran, I was actually completing my master's at the University of Pennsylvania, studying with McHarg and working on the Partisan Project in his office as a student, as a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania. As I left the university, I was wife and who really needed to come back to Texas, and as I was leaving McHarg, his office, he told me that it was a mistake going back to Texas at that point in history because of the status of the profession back then in Texas. But if I was intent on going, the one person I had to meet was Pliny Fisk. And so I went down to Austin, met Pliny, worked with him for a short while, and then I began teaching at Texas A&M University. The short time that I worked with Pliny changed my life, and was the opportunity to then be able to touch base with Pliny, interact with him over a period of years, be a research fellow there at the center. I think it's the perfect time that we're having Pliny here as our Design Week visionary this week. This point in history is kind of slamming down on our heads, as everyone knows. Humanity is at a turning point in history. How we choose to engage these complex, adaptive, regenerative systems that we call the landscape is going to determine our future and the future of all living systems on Earth. How we as landscape architects make decisions and how we lead humanity to make better decisions is going to determine the degree to which our health and prosperity and survival occurs. It's ideal that we're having Pliny talk to us at this point in history because for the last 40 years or more, Pliny has co-directed the Center for Maximum Potential Building Systems in Austin, Texas. As Jody said, a sustainability education research demonstration nonprofit in Austin, Texas. And he's provided the visionary leadership, in addition to co-directing, has provided the visionary leadership of the center as to help society learn better how to deal with Earth as a metabolic system. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce my dear friend Pliny Fisk and to have him be the visionary for Design Week 2012. Thank you.
Cool. Do I use that? I use this and this. I've never had 3 mics. Wow. This is going to change everything, huh? So, everybody has read the book Blink, right? Blink basically is all about the fact that you have got to get your mind, hello? 4, number 4. Get your mind totally open to the point that you think that this is going to be so impossible to absorb until you realize that Blink basically says you're getting a lot more at every moment than you think you're getting. So essentially the issue here is that you have an entire curriculum going on in one day. So you've got your mind revved up, the engines are going. This is the Indianapolis racetrack for sustainability. So one of the things that I have to say before I go too far is how cool it is to work with these 2 people. And every time I sort of come back to this place after lecturing goodness knows where, that I'm so impressed with this faculty. And I mentioned to 1 or 2 of the students here this morning that the density of knowledge and the density of awareness and abilities are sort of packed into Ball State in this program. So, if you don't get it from me, you'll get it about recycled twice over from them because we have this mental telepathy between each other. And we totally understand what each other is talking about at all times. So if you don't get it the first time, you have 2 other opportunities. So I'm one of these Texans. I wear a hat because my head is bare and it's cold outside. But there's sort of a lot of other things that relate to being a Texan. And that is that you have this adventuresome spirit. And that if I were to sort of make believe that this is a more intimate workshop, I'd go around and I'd check everybody's hands out. Right? So I tell right away who the bullshitters are. Not too bad. Leather gloves, that's a good excuse. So a lot of this, even though it sounds very theoretical and very up in the air, I'm going to sort of circle a little bit for a moment. So I guess one of the things is that you see lots of materials up here. You sort of look at this person. It sort of looks like a little bit like Back to the Future. And you say, does that person actually do this stuff? How do they live and work, and what's the place like? Where do they come from? So, every one of the things here we actually live with every day. We use, we build with. The office is the Advanced Green Builder Demonstration for landscape as well as building for the state of Texas. So we have 5 agencies involved in that. They all funded it. They had never talked to each other in their entire life before, which is sort of interesting because what this whole big word sustainability is about is right on the edge. It's not that department, it's not this department, it's not that discipline, it's not this discipline. And the more you mix the soup, and the more you realize this egg situation is where you learn, then lots of things can begin to happen. So you get into not only understanding what things can do in a hands-on manner, and that you get used to them, and it's sort of another level of things, because some of the things that we deal with have never been dealt with before, but since they're so important, we absorb them and put them into anything that we can possibly get them into. So if I randomly go here, pick this one up. So here is a 100% recycled content cement. Has no Portland cement in it at all. It's 2 or 3 times stronger. It derives from waste. We spec this for, among other things, for the U.S. Pentagon. Because this little strange East Austin hilltop office actually did all the green specking for the U.S. Pentagon. So the wedge that happened to be hit was fortunately the first wedge that we had redone. And it was all done with that. So here it is, trash. The aggregate is trash. The cement is trash. So when we respec that part of the Pentagon, and it happens to be that the plane hit that versus all other wedges, it was sort of interesting. Because the plane did not penetrate. Because as you can imagine, knowing what the Pentagon shape is, if it did penetrate and it went all the way to the center of that building, the whole building would have gone. So this averages twice the strength of Portland cement. But what's important about it? The important thing is that because it's waste, it actually does not produce the global warming problem, because Portland cement is about equivalent to 6%, one material of all the global warming. So it's sort of interesting. this building that we're in. The other interesting thing is this the future? If I look at the whole life cycle of this, and I actually include the coal-fired power plant that produced it as waste, is that good? In other words, if I go to China and I show China this and they say, oh, great, we can go burn more coal because it makes cement and it makes energy. Not a very good deal. So as I sort of look at if I look at the situation here, there's another interesting thing that hits me because we are what? 98% water, right? So you're water. So here's water and Portland cement sitting in the room. One plant. So if I go over here right next to this, and I pick this up, this derives from the treating of water. So if I look at your state, and I look at your groundwater situation, and I look at the change that's beginning to happen, like, by the way, approximately 2/3 of the United States is in this situation, that you have more and more saline waters. The higher your saline water, the more you got to treat it. And the more you treat it, guess what? You get that. But there's a big, big difference between this and this, besides color. This life cycle derives from things that are actually plus plus, not plus and then minus minus. Because the other things that go on with this material, believe it or not, low firing, neutral in carbon, so it hits that 6%. It does not need fresh water to make the concrete. You know how much water this stuff uses, or Portland cement uses? It's the equivalent of fresh water of entire countries on a worldwide basis. So some people, particularly architects, by the way, you guys are much wiser. What does this have to do with me? Why do these things become relevant? Mainly because as we spec and as we design, either one of us, I'm both, architect, landscape architect, I don't differentiate between the two. As we design and as we specify things, we're basically planning regions. Who you ask to supply something, who you pay, where your money goes, really determines the metabolics of that place. So who you're supporting makes a big difference, both ecologically, employment-wise, supporting of regional context in many, many ways. So we also do a lot of policy. So it's an unusual situation. So here we get our hands dirty. We have these wild ideas. We build buildings out of this stuff. And then the city of Austin, and you say, you know, we'd like to ask you some questions. This was about 20 years ago. Do you have any ideas about how to create a citywide sustainability program? So my wife and co-director of the center happen to pick up the phone. And whenever anybody asks a ridiculous question like that, you say, absolutely, we have all the answers. And the city comes back and says, yeah, right. So we formed a partnership. So we created the first green building program in the world. So is that architecture? Is that landscape architecture? Is that planning? Is that policy? Is that the materials that you see up here? What is that about? And then it won the Earth Summit Award in Rio. That helped because the city of Austin didn't know what the green building program was. And when you win an international award, then people begin to listen. Hey, what's that about? And then you start doing these things. Gradually, 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 they begin to snowball further and further. So we had a dynamite governor at that time in Texas, a woman by the name of Ann Richards. So Ann Richards folks come along and say, hey, we'd like to do that at the state level. So here's this weird place called Texas. First green building program in the world? You're kidding me. I grew up in the Northeast. Texas is the boonies. Austin I'd never heard of other than being the music capital of the Southwest. So all of a sudden, place and opportunity begins to flip. And you never know where opportunity might be. So before you knew it, Texas was the first state in the country to redo their architecture and engineering guidelines along a sustainability bent. Soon after that, the Lady Bird Johnson Center began to do the site version of LEED. So a lot of the landscape angle related to LEED also derived quite a lot from Austin. So it's a situation where, as we got into doing these things, and as we got respect from a variety of different places that were very unpredictable, we sort of said, well, does this technique and does that process and that way of thinking actually relate to this as well? And that, and that, and that? And we began to find not true. So working for rural towns in South Texas was a very, very different thing than working with the city of Austin. Now, I'm not giving you a time chronology here. We actually started working on the border in South Texas with some of the most outspoken Mexican-American politically astute people that got us in deep, deep trouble for a while in Texas. They had very different ways of thinking. It was not Austin, Texas. It was not the state of Texas. In fact, the state of Texas and Austin, Texas said, these guys, Fisk, be real careful of. In fact, the University of Texas for a while never even let students come out to our place because we were working with the revolutionaries in South Texas. But what has happened to us is that we have gotten this tremendous combination of knowledge that we've tried to capture in various ways because each one of these experiences were valuable enough in themselves that they deserved another way of thinking. It deserved to be put down and it deserved to be shared. And one of the things we stayed out of is trying to take all these experiences and filter them through a single lens. So we diversified and kept the possibilities going to the extent that what this is about could add another one tomorrow, next week. In fact, it's interesting. In reviewing a foundation in Texas' strategy for the year 2020, and they had funded us 6 times. In fact, they're funding us to do this right now, which is unusual for any foundation to do anything else than really drastically important social issues in need. But they said this has to do with so many things in our state. So I put together another scenario similar to these scenarios, and I sent it to them. I said, wouldn't it be interesting for us to map Texas and how it's changed in the last 20 years? Oh, beautiful. Thank you. And so we started looking at this. And we began to realize that everything had changed. 20 years. More forest fires, more tornadoes, more drought, more flood, more hurricanes, all battering the state. And being an old McCart guy, I go and map all this stuff. And I'd overlay the impacts. And all of a sudden you begin to say, my goodness, there's an entirely different, what I like to call working atlas for our state. So that could be another lens. The strategies that are needed where I come from that might be paralleled in certain ways in what you're doing here. I understand you had a little drought this summer. Some odd reason it didn't happen to hit here. Happens all around you. Sort of like last summer, I kind of come out to the end of my driveway and I look to the left, to the east, and the entire sky is black. 34,000 acres gone. 1,600 homes. 3 days. Look to the right, to the west. The other side of Austin's burning. Did I ever guess in my life that this would be happening at the end of my driveway, thinking, my goodness, if it comes a little bit further from the east and comes from the west, I'm right in the middle. So it's a very different world very rapidly. 20 years is nothing. So a lot of what I like to think is going on here is a little bit anticipatory. That you have a tool chest, what we like to call lenses. And that I can borrow from this one, and I can borrow from that one, and I can mix it up. I can begin to take this part of this and that part of that, and begin to apply it in a slightly new way. So I'm mapping crazy. I can't understand where I might have inherited this from. Might have been my landscape architecture background. So maps mean a lot. Recording things, putting things in files, overlaying them, coming up with ridiculous possibilities that no one has dreamt of, but should be, because they're obvious. So in order to pull this off, you need what we call, and I'm going to start with this one, and I'm going to go through many of these, depending on what the dynamics is and so on. By the way, did we set up Twitter and tweets? We did?
Yeah. Simon said that. Yeah, Simon got that set up.
Simon, where are you?
I'm right here.
Cool. Would you like to explain to these people what their communication apparatus is?
Hang on a second.
still need to set this up so that people can use it.
Well, explain to us what you're about to do then.
Well, as soon as we find out, we've got some students who are hopefully prolific tweeters, and we can potentially throw some tag words up, some keywords throughout the day at various points, I'm assuming. We still need to convene and go over what the plan is for that.
Okay, well, this is going to be going on for several days. There's a little bit of a chance here, too.
We've got a good shot at it.
Good shot.
Yeah.
But I mean, at the least, one could put, you know, that topic up and say, hey, what did you say? Or I didn't understand this, or I didn't understand that. Do you think we could get that going pretty soon?
We got that going right now.
Cool.
And folks can follow it. It's going to be, the name of the Twitter account is Maximum Potential. That'll be at max_potential. And we'll put hashtags up for the various topics so we can crowdsource the way information is being disseminated throughout the week. Hopefully, as things are progressing and things come up, we can look at the Twitter account and see where the links are at that point.
Great. How many people use this modern day phenomenon? How many people are with it here? Nobody. 1, 2, 3. Well, you are the teachers for everyone else. Could you put your hands up again? High. High, 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 high. Oh, 2. Oh, now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Not too bad. So this is going to be a way of me finding out and these two people finding out what came across, what kinds of questions are being asked, how can we address these questions over the week's period. So I'm going to start with a very sophisticated one right here. Area Point Network. How did Area Point Network come about? Well, like many of these, but in this case, rural towns come into the rural town, and as a nonprofit, you're never given the right amount of funding. I'm sure that you guys have never heard about this at Ball State University, to do miraculous things. So here in this case, the town got shut off of all their gas. So for some odd reason, they thought that we had possible solutions. We were a young organization. We began to absorb the fact that we were in Texas. And one of the things we began to absorb is a very weird phenomenon, and the fact that there was a material called mesquite wood. And mesquite wood, I found early on, had more energy value per pound than our coal. So I mapped it. And these crazy Mexican Americans found at a conference that we had done this kind of thing. So when the Lavaca Gas Company came along and said, well, you guys haven't paid your share for the gas this quarter. If you don't come up with the money in the next 3 weeks, we're going to shut you off. Guess what they did? They shut them off. So you've got about 8,000 to 10,000 people, and you've got to think fast. The only wild-haired gringo in town, and we're going to depend on that person to do this? You're kidding. So because we have begun to do what we call area resource mapping now, we had a pretty good idea how much mesquite was around. We knew the distances. We knew possible even strategies because we had all the river bottoms mapped. Because reading between the lines and having to think fast, radical Mexican Americans in South Texas, surrounded by the largest ranches in the United States, were not going to be a popular combination to collect mesquite wood. So what do we have to do? We took those 10-wheel drive trucks that we got out of surplus in San Antonio, and we went right up the river bottoms. You know why? Nobody knows exactly where their property line is in the river bottom. So we could go anywhere. The other thing is it happens that a lot of the dead mesquite wood was where? River bottoms. Didn't have to cut a bloody thing. Didn't have to go on anybody's land that they knew of. So a lot of these things that you see here developed out of fairly major need. So we began to take this very seriously. We mapped lots of stuff after a while. Mapped all the soils of various types, not only for food, but also for materials. So I found the extraordinary situation that I could take a material that covered 60% of the state of Texas, a calcium carbonate-based material, and I could mix it with some of those other cement stuff, things, Portland cement, fly ash cement, magnesium oxide cement, and I could pass unified building code. And I could get equipment if I readjusted where my knowledge base was coming from, and I could produce massive quantities of unfired, stabilized brick. They would pass building codes, and I could put up, in one small facility, 50 homes a week. So I began to compile these maps. And one of the things that it would be very interesting here is to maybe initiate what might be called a working atlas for this part of the country. Because you don't start doing it, you don't begin to get the sort of ecology of combinations of things that lead to other things. So here are two materials, mesquite, caliche, available to everybody, everywhere, 60% practically of the state of Texas, fuel, and a way of doing housing or walls or paths or roads. It was fairly fundamental and very low energy and very simple for lots of small businesses to be able to get into. So what is the problem with a lot of these rural towns? They cannot figure out how to economically keep going. This is not new. This was happening 35, 40 years ago with us in rural Texas. Same situation. Gets repeated, repeated, and repeated. So one of the many things that I used to do, I used to have one of these block machines in the back of my true to be spirit and who I am, my VW flatbed pickup truck. Pliny Fisk comes into town, his mixer, his brick maker, 1,000 bricks a day. So gradually, we were able to do schools, homes, Girl Scout buildings, all sorts of things that were sort of prototypes and triggers for that community to say, whoa, didn't have any idea that that could happen. And if you're lucky, you plant these things where lots of people begin to hear about it. And the best place to hear about it, schools, Girl Scout headquarters. Because they tell parents. Parents say, hey, you must be crazy. That building's made out of soil. The lintels are made out of soil. The lintels are reinforced with bamboo. What kind of a place is that? It's our Girl Scout headquarters. Come see. So with area resources, we began to create, if they weren't there already, what we call point resources. It's very sophisticated. This is PhD level planning. Point resources represent how an area resource can be used in that place. And you need an example. And you need as many examples as you can possibly get. But these could also be businesses. Did anybody there ever think about using mesquite for major fuel? The caliche beyond roads and into buildings? And as you begin to ask those questions and you begin to look at history of a place, very, very seldom do you find that something has never been thought of. So history begins to be a very different way of thinking about these things, but it also becomes a very important overlay because people begin to realize, you know, this has been done before. Mesquite, backyard, barbecue is everywhere. The gatherers of that mesquite wood are everywhere. The caliche, surface mining areas are everywhere. It's just that it has never been applied to what you're doing. So point resources, businesses, examples, buildings up. How many of them are there? Are there enough to go to the next step? That you're developing local networks? Because this is the most powerful thing that you can be doing, is the flow of materials and energy and information and currency at a local, regional basis. That is the more stabilized, stable, future way of thinking. Because just knowing about this and it's not used, or just some kook off in the woods doing something neat, versus actually being involved in a local economy is a big difference. So you're actually trying to reinforce regional and local economies. And when you do this, you begin to get more and more conscious of lots of different things. Take this building here. And the only other building that I know about that does this at the moment is a parks headquarters in Arizona. And the park system headquarters does a very, very simple thing. It took 25 years for this to make the rounds, however. Nighttime cooling. Now, nighttime cooling here isn't quite as good as it is there. But as I go to West Texas, I can take a beer cooler lid and I can put it out at night with about that much water in it, and I can make ice at about 46 degrees Fahrenheit temperature. Magic. Anybody have any idea how that happens? Clear night skies that radiate to a black body. If it's low enough humidity, I can do that at 52 degrees Fahrenheit temperature because that black body is so strong that it just pulls that temperature out. So if I trickle water over a corrugated white painted roof at night I can always get that water down to the dew point temperature. So am I familiar with climate things? Absolutely. Am I familiar with passive ways of doing simple stuff with climate? Absolutely. Am I beginning to get in my mind, oh, I can do this here and I can't do it there? If I propose this in East Texas, I'd be put in the loony bin? Houston, humid. El Paso, dry. Totally different kinds of situations. These situations, I guarantee, exist here, but they're much more subtle, and you have to know much more about what you're doing because of that subtleness. The guy that sits in there, Bob Kester, I've known for many, many years, since he was a student at Kentucky. That place is a wealth of knowledge on this subject. One of the best in the country. Probably the best, I would say, of anywhere in the country sitting in a school of architecture and planning and landscape architecture. So, recycled paper, coal-fired power plants. I don't care particularly what the sources are. I care about that they're there, and I want to know the metabolics basically without becoming an expert in that, knowing enough that I can begin to put scenarios together, that I can begin to actually say, paper is cool. I can build entire houses out of paper. I go to a place like Houston, there's so much waste paper, it's mind-boggling. Mountains. Any shipping area. So this paper and all the work behind it was done what? By a forestry research lab in Wisconsin. All the information is available. They span 14 feet. Beams, paper. This stuff fascinates me because what this is here, this is the future landscape. This is how the landscape of the future, whether you call it landscape architecture, regional planning, geography, this or that or whatever, it's the same. And then I look, that place that 34,000 acres burned, and if you catch it just at the right time, that's 34,000 acres of cured wood. So again, you begin to see byproducts, virgin products. There's a pool of a lot of things out there. So the byproduct from the forest being all these trees, to me is really interesting. How do you treat that wood in such a way that all the houses wouldn't burn down the next time? So you put feelers out there. You start asking questions. You do a little bit of research. And then these guys come up on the screen. One crazy woman, Karen Slemick, PhD, microbiology, turned herself into a material scientist, found a way of putting silica in the wood, 5-hour fire test. The very trees that she uses are the trees that just got cured in 34,000 acres in just east of me. The weirdest thing that she found is that some Weisenheim in the backyard one day took his big pickup truck and decided that he's going to show that this wood can be split. So he took the pickup truck and put it on an angle, put the wood on the angle, pickup truck comes along, tries to go up this thing, the wood bends like a pretzel. Couldn't get up, backs up, bingo. Wood went right back to its original form. So they look at this and they say, whoa, that wasn't the original plan. All we were doing is trying to cure the wood. And what did they find? 2.5-fold increase in strength. So now I have this database in my mind going. Every area, every point, every network, I'm beginning to bring in new businesses. I'm beginning to reinforce things. I'm beginning to say, my goodness, I can convert all that wood to wood for housing, and it will last 100 years, because the other thing is, this will not deteriorate for 100 years. So what's the future? The future is actually trying to get ourselves out of big problems and to begin to mix things up in such a way that you can do it. Here's a paper brick. It has safe fire things in this that are almost making it as good as a regular brick. In fact, some of these things are better because they don't explode. Anybody ever been looking at what happens in a forest fire? Housing, structures. Portland cement explodes. Bricks explode. It's a total phenomena that you're not used to even thinking about. So, is this the brick of the future? That area of Texas, the 34,000 acres, the lower end almost touches the outskirts of the Houston area, where the paper comes from. So, just to make sure that you know the Back to the Future guy is actually talking about real things, I brought real companies with me that produce this stuff that you can go and spec. You can go and call up. You can say, hey, what would it take for me to bring that into Indiana to develop a point resource and a business that could actually begin to upgrade lots of things, and together you're beginning to get a whole series of possibilities that give, for example, the demonstrations that you're going to do on the White River real importance. Because what you're doing, whether you'd like to admit it or not, should be prototypes. Every single thing that we do as an organization, which is a research, educational organization just like you, every single one of them, particularly if it's out in the world sitting there, is a prototype. Whether you're willing to admit it or not, it's a prototype. People are looking because they think that we know what we're talking about. And that this stands for something that is really big. So I'm going to begin to go, I'm going to ask, any tweets going on, tweeter things going on? I'm going to ask some questions, yeah. Any questions, answers? Something that you thought, oh, I didn't really want to get into this so deep today. Or what does it have to do with landscape architecture? There's a good question. No questions. Question.
Hello. My name is Susan Tomizawa. I'm faculty here. My question is, how do you balance the use of nature, as with the mesquite wood, with actually preserving habitat and the needs of the natural world?
Very good question. Everybody heard that question? So what we'd like to think we're doing is that we're basically resource managers. Resource management means, to a rancher, mesquite is taking over whole huge areas of Texas. It takes all the water. It has the most unbelievable root system. In fact, there's more biomass in the root than there is in the tree above the surface. So what we like to think we're doing in that case is that we're actually getting rid of an invasive species that begins to overtake large regions of the state and happens to be a renewable energy source and happens to also, if I switch over here, I can make beautiful floors, beautiful tiles, beautiful many things, and there's whole little industries throughout the state that are going and getting that invasive species and using it and getting rid of it where it needs to be gotten rid of. And we have gotten into that kind of thing very often. I'll be going over a farm tonight that's a demonstration farm for the state of Texas. So one of the things that we're known for past-wise in our work is creating a lot of what's called the straw bale movement, building with straw. Why would we build it with straw? It's the largest temperate grassland on earth, and we're sitting in the middle of it. What kind of straw did we actually bale to make the building for the demonstration building for farmers in Texas? Buffalo grass. Not buffalo, buffalo. And if anybody's ever looked at a map of buffalo grass invasion, you probably have about 10 states of invasion. So what do? We don't go and just bale any species. We bale buffalo grass. We get rid of it. We sequester it. We put it into the walls of this building that will last 100 years. Don't let the seeds get out. Don't let the materials get out. Sequester it. Get rid of it. So the farmer is a manager of very essential things that are absolutely destroying large areas in Texas, both crops, by the way, and animal forage. Another question. I'm going to use that as an example of another part of what we do. So I'm going to skip over here for a moment. So this is called eco-balance. And eco-balance derived from a very simple realization. There's a lot of talk about life cycle. Life cycle, where things come from, where things go, has become an entire industry. Life cycle assessment. What is the impact from the sourcing, the transport, the processing, the use, the resourcing? So years ago, we came up with a process and a technique of thinking that said, you know, this is so important. Where do things come from? Where do things go? That it should be a fundamental way of designing, planning, specifying. Can be deep, can be very technical, can actually be very facile and ways of picking up things that you can understand on an everyday design basis. But is everything for grabs? So at one end, we say there's land that needs to be preserved, conserved, put to the side and not used to do what I'm about to go over. Let nature do what nature knows best. On the other end, you have restorative issues. You have hazards. You have land that actually needs us to participate to improve things, to bring it back again, maybe all the way to the point of this happening. In between, we have all the life support areas. So here's a very sophisticated life cycle. You guys ready? You got it? Source, resource. How much land did this take? How much land did that take? Anybody have any idea? It's a fairly fundamental issue on the planet. This takes about 5,000 square feet for me on a yearly basis. Good forest, good understory, rich biological community in the soils. That's how much it takes. How much did this take? About 7,500 square feet. So one of the things going on here is very fundamental stuff about life cycles and how much area does it take. I just did the sourcing and the resourcing. Can I do that for water? Can I be always conscious of both ends of this thing? Conscious of the oxygen as well as the sink? Conscious of the water harvesting as well as the water treating? And doing this in a manner that actually is nature-driven? So in our place, you walk in, and this is the office where we work. So everybody comes into the office, and they're large tanks. There's 14,800 gallons of tanks. And a person comes along and says, "What's that? Is this some kind of a petroleum farm or something?" We say, "No, it's kind of interesting what it is that you don't even realize. That's how much water it takes for a family of 3 to use 1/3 water conservation of the Advanced Green Building Demonstration in Austin, Texas, following the Green Building Program that won the Earth Summit Award. And if we followed what that program was about, we need twice the number of tanks." So one of the things that EcoBalance does is it begins to size things. It begins to map things. It begins to say there are areas involved with what you were talking about, and this is the future way of doing planning. House, community, city. How much wetland did it take to treat that amount of water? Is that part of the areas that we should be conscious of for the resourcing of that water? How much roof did it take? So if you come to our place, you begin to see, whoa, these are the strangest roofs I've ever seen. In fact, these guys must be a little bit nuts, because we had to put roofs over roofs. Now, anybody in their right mind says, you know, you're catching rain twice, huh? That's a wise way of operating. And so you begin to realize that, you know, one roof over another roof, given a certain amount of space, guess what? Rain, precipitation, does not come down straight. It comes down at angles. So what you're doing is increasing the surface area of your roof enough that you can actually balance the amount of water input, sourcing, and your wetlands resourcing, so that this whole thing would balance at 1/3 of what Austin calls conservation. At the time, Austin called conservation 75 gallons per person. At 75 gallons per person, we would have had a tank farm. This idea that this little drum sitting underneath your downspout actually is meaningful. We have little concept of sizes of things in this so-called sustaining, balanced world that we keep talking about. We don't have the pieces together. So what we began to do is we got very sophisticated. You know, how long can you exist without air? 3 minutes? Water? 3 days? Food? 3 weeks? So we go down sort of a hierarchy of needs. Energy, you can begin to argue back and forth. Depends on winter, depends on summer. Materials, you can even argue further, because everything that I just talked about has something to do with materials. Can you balance each one of these? Once you do one thing, that you're automatically, in how you're thinking, doing the other? Are you actually thinking of the source, mapped, or where, or how, the processing, the taking of that roof water that has all those critters every night wandering all over it? You don't want to drink it direct? Take that stuff out. Use it. Resource it. And why do we have this person standing there with the plant in their hands? Because we're also admitting this is not just go and say, hey, nature knows what to do. This is saying we are active participants. We are guiders. We are managers. We are land resource people that have the responsibility to actually do things that improve stuff. So this is a new era. This is the era of what geographers and historians and so on call the era of the Anthropocene, the era where humans dominate the planet. And unless you begin to put a human within that equation, these things aren't going to happen. So we map air. We map the area that it takes. We go and we actually can figure out the holding capacity of that piece of land, the boundary. And some people come along to me and say, oh, you mean you're doing this weird space colony stuff. You're building a wall around the piece of land, and all the air that's there is the air that you get, and that's it. Some weird survivalist thing. And what we say to that is, yeah, the problem is we have been working with no boundaries. We haven't been able to define things enough that we can actually go and figure something out. Saying what the holding capacity is. Or I can do that with water. I can go and do the suitability of where wetlands is, or are, or going to be. I can do the suitability of where the best places are to collect the water, either on roofs or on the ground, partially because of my vegetation around, partially because of the leaf litter, partially because of the slope, partially because of this, part of that. And now I'm beginning to understand this in a way that I begin to map things in a slightly different way than I was mapped when I was mapping for Ian McHarg. Ian McHarg was doing what? Don't touch. Conserve. This puts people right into the middle. It says, you have got to understand that creating of cycles is the most important thing that we can be doing. Helping those cycles. Not no touch. No touch is over here. If it's a real bad hazard situation and it's a flood zone, that's no touch. This is active. This is a different way of thinking about the land. This is permaculture. This is Zero Energy Research Institute. This is a different set of expertise that are out there that, to be very frank with you, the landscape profession hardly knows about. This is upgrading things to the point where you are producing more. You are so good at managing the land that you can actually do better without destroying the very processes that you're using. I can produce more food. Polyface farms in the Virginia area. Unbelievable amount of production of food in the same given piece of land that if I were to use the normal agriculture, no way. So if I'm doing a farm demonstration for the state of Texas, I am actually borrowing that kind of knowledge for that farm from a basic responsibility standpoint. I don't even care whether the Texas Department of Agriculture knows anything about permaculture. It's my job to connect them to it. It's my job to say there's such a thing as really integrated farming, that every step that a farmer takes, this eco-balance process, integrated time and time and time again, is producing more. Let me give you a little example. Let's say that my wastewater comes off the roof, I go through the process within my building, I take my wastewater and I put it into a forest. The forest, by the way, is a very, very good treater of wastewater. And most of the treatment happens in the soil. Is it that 5,000 square feet, 7,500 square feet of the that I talked about for air? It's very interesting what happens. The productivity of the forest goes up because I'm bringing my wastewater in, and the productivity gets increased by about 20%. So I need less area for the... Am I doing anything related to space planning in cities that say that park is a little bit beyond being important just to go and do the bicycle route and walk and run through? Is that park actually a whole major metabolic component of that city for air and water and treatment and all the things that enable that city to really work as an ecological system? Rarely are we talking about them this way. We still talk about it in little pockets here and there. There's a little city in California that, hey, they're doing a cool wetland system. But very, very rarely are we saying, put it into that open space system, use the blue pipe coming out of that wastewater treatment plant, happens right down the street from us in Austin, Texas. The blue pipe has treated wastewater going right into the open space systems. Can I use that for my tap water for drinking? No. So with this kind of eco-balance process, there are rules that go with it. There's a new set of rules. There's a weird colored pipe, and you've got to know what the weird colored pipe is about, and you've got to get the doggone wastewater treatment people knowing that a blue-purple pipe even exists. Sorry, purple pipe. Then if you're really good, you begin to say, hey, you know, the suitability map that I've come up with begins to come up with certain kinds of themes. And I intuitively begin to get to know these things well enough. So I say, you know, because of the soils and because of this and because of that and the orientation and how that's associated with this area, I can begin to take what I call, in one case, buffalo gourd in Texas. So buffalo gourd are one of these typical invasive plants. You know, that round, little gourd. Grows like the dickens. Now I'm telling you these as stories because I know that they're parallels where you are. So some old guy up at Texas Tech says, you know, if these things are growing like this every direction, and we can't help it, just no matter what we do, they keep growing, let's sort of work with it a little bit. Let's find out what's in it. In fact, he went a little bit further. He said, in a very sophisticated experiment, he showed it one day. It was on his windowsill in his office. So 3 varieties. A little bit of water in this one, a little bit of water in that one, a little bit of water of all 3, and a little bit more in these over here, a little bit more in those over there, and he chose the ones that used the least water and produced what? The most fuel, because the seed, you crush it, and it's a polyunsaturated fuel oil that I can put right into my tractor. The pulp is so rich in sugars that I can take the pulp and put it to the side, and I can come up with my ethanol. Now, did I learn all these things in school? Nope. Learned these things basically because they're fascinating. Really interesting stuff. And you begin to gradually begin to get more and more knowledgeable about these things to the point that you have a sort of other ecology knowledge of what to do. And so it's partially based on this way of thinking. So we're very conscious also of whether things are happening inside or outside a boundary. So we have a little vocabulary about what happens inside the boundary versus what happened outside the boundary, or partially outside the boundary. Simple things like that become very important because all that stuff has to do with distance, has to do with the possibility of integrating, has to do with partners next door. It has to do with an ecology of bringing people and skills and this and that and the other thing together. And then I go another step. And I take strange databases that sort of come from Protoscope over here. Take these things. And I begin to learn other things about how to inject what's going on here because I'm very conscious of who are my peers. Who am I hanging out with? What conferences do I go to? Do I belong to the crazy permaculture group locally? Can they teach me things? Do I have a place in my operation that they meet in every Saturday? So I can sit there, learn, connect to. Or if I'm going another place in the world, my responsibility is also to go and connect those people to that same thing. So these databases, like this one, is a very magical database. Everybody knows who Paul Hawken is. So Paul Hawken is a very successful entrepreneur and also a fantastic person to think about the ecology of business and how businesses necklace with each other to make an ecology. But this particular database is magical because this particular database says, you know, there are people with good thinking all over the globe. So all these nonprofits and these NGOs and all these people that think, oh, they're doing such important, phenomenal work, but nobody respects them. Nobody knows about them. Nobody this, nobody that. So you know what he did? He collected over 1 million of us. And what did I do? I took the database and I overlaid it over the biomes of the planet. So if I go someplace and I'm connecting, pattern-wise over here, I begin to find out who my peers are. And I connect to them. And I learn at that place for every one of the topics I'm talking about. They're sitting there in a database. So does this knowledge come out of sort of the ether? Or does it really come out of a whole series of tools that I'm always thinking about and always bringing to the forebear and putting it, some organization behind it, into filing and so on, so I can become a new professional. So I do permaculture planning. The inputs and outputs and the connections between the plants and the animals and the food and the conservation, all these things beginning to work together. Questions? Too much. Must be much too much for these guys. I can keep on going for 2 days.
Oh, but do you want to go through a run on those?
Okay, let's go. I was thinking there might be questions. I can just keep going here. Questions? No questions.
Are there any questions? We've got about a half hour. So we've got Ken and then Carla.
I'm intrigued by this invasive gourd species you were talking about.
You
And
guys hear him back there?
Is that working?
Speak up a little louder.
I'm intrigued by the invasive species gourd business you were talking about, and I was just wondering if that business has matured enough that it's actually having a positive impact on the negative invasive species.
In that case, I don't know. In the case of baling buffalo grass, there are quite a number of farm buildings that have now borrowed that technique. As to taking over all farm buildings in Texas, no. So let me give a perspective on that. So it's a good question. So we come out with prototypes, and we think, gee whiz, this is cool stuff. How far does it get? Is it repeated? So, Austin Green Building Program. Austin Green Building Program has a lot of the things that I'm talking about approvable. So you can get your star rating for the Austin Green Building Program by doing a lot of the things I'm talking about. How many homes, and I can't say do all these things, but actually do many things to make them green in our particular part in our city. So about 3 weeks ago, the 10,000th home got approved. So here's this little demonstration building up at our place. It did the fly ash cement, got converted into the industry. So I can pick up the phone and I can say, hey, you guys advertise green cement. Can I get such and such a mix of fly ash in my cement? Sure, how much you want, sir? I can do that now in my region in about 4 out of 6 cement concrete delivery groups. Now, is this anywhere near the speed of exception? I mean, exception? What am I trying to say? Acceptance. Thank you very much. That I would like? No. Is the gourd guy in the panhandle in Texas really taking off? Very slow. I know of one farmer doing that. Actually using that as a fuel in their tractors. So the reality is, how many of us are there doing this kind of thing? How many of us are there trying to produce the opportunities that are going to be needed to make that transition? Sometimes it happens by magic. I mean, this guy, one day, here I am at the open house, and we have open houses the first Friday of every month for the last 35 years. Most amazing group of people come in. Never is it advertised. It's just word of mouth, people come. There are always about 40 to 60 to 70 people coming. All walks of life. Home builders, developers. A city council member that's trying to figure out what do we really do these days. All mixed up together. So one of these open houses, this guy comes and raises his hand and he says, you know, I want everybody here, the open house, to know this. These guys showed me the mix and how to do this and how to do that. And here's my product. So he comes out with a 100% fly ash fascia brick, the most beautiful brick I've ever seen. He says, I have convinced my people in North Texas, and we are in business. Year later, open house. Guy comes over and says, you're the guys. And I thought, well, maybe I'm in real trouble this time. So you're the guys that did all those shades in that farm in Laredo. Yep. Well, you know, we're the guys that do all the airport shading on every airport practically in the southwestern United States. You know where we got the idea from? You guys. Now, there's only one problem in these models that I'm coming up with. They didn't make any bloody money.
Let's take another question. Oh, it's...
Yeah, Carl Corbin, faculty member in landscape architecture. I wanted to ask about the eco balance and to what extent scale plays a factor.
Good question. Everybody heard that question? So, some think scale is a big, big deal. I cannot get the volume and quantity of things that I'm talking about without beginning to get industry participating in what I'm doing. I am not creating by fly ash cement in my backyard. So the idea of what's beyond the boundary, what boundary it's in, all that becomes part of the metabolics and the energetics, the amount of energy that goes into things. But other things we find, like the water harvesting. Water harvesting, time and time again, the economics becomes good enough where we are in Texas that now you can actually get a tax rebate for doing that on a decentralized basis, because the decentralized basis does what for the city? It actually goes and prevents the need for them to extend their pipes. It's the same exact thing with the sewage. Why does the county get very involved with us in wanting to do a wetland? They can't afford extending their sewage lines further. It's too expensive. So they're beginning to say many of these things can be decentralized. We can go and give you rebates, incentives, all kinds of things, because in the end, it pays us to go and do that. Is there another? Is that answering at all? But you were thinking of something else, I can tell.
But I was thinking, I think you turned it off, John.
No, it's on.
Okay. I was thinking more, I guess, about natural systems, but of course that is not the only system that needs to be balanced.
Well, so water and wastewater. I mean, it's sort of amazing to me that, you know, at a city level, Austin, Texas, how much energy goes in to the water system and the wastewater system. 54% of all the energy in Austin goes for water transport and processing. So from a larger system sense, and they're pretty good. They have purple. Does everybody know what purple pipe is? I was shocked the other day that purple pipe is not even thought about here. You know, he says, shakes heads, yes? Yes. Good. So, you know, it's sort of interesting. The position of things is so crucial. So here's a wastewater treatment plant. So a wastewater treatment plant, from all aspects, from, you know, if it's combined runoff with sewage, bad deal in one respect. Very interesting deal in another respect, because the drainage system, actually you can go and reverse the other way with a purple pipe and bring your treated water back up the watershed to those places that need it, in the same system that you're trying to actually upgrade to make better, so that you're separating your drainage and your sewage. That's happened in 2 micro watersheds in Austin, where the trigger in doing this kind of thing, they don't call it eco-balance, has created another level of understanding of what the channel is that takes the water up the other way, that can actually be a solution for separating at the next stage what they're doing, which is a little bit of a shame that a lot of wastewater systems still do this, but everybody know what I'm talking about? Drainage is mixed with sewage, so every time it rains, your river becomes quite extraordinary. I know, your river, not my river, your river. Another question. Some real difficult questions. Go ahead.
So, Austin is an awesome place. We love it.
Bruce, hold on a second, and if you could get on the mic so that we can pick it up on the webcast.
So, Austin is a great place, and their energy is a city department, and so they have a supply side opportunity that very few cities have, right, in terms of how they, so they, a lot more green power and other things. In the Midwest, and here, we're on the what was the Trenton gas field, and so all this industry that located here a century ago had all this free energy. And when that was gone, we became the factory floor for Detroit. And when Detroit was gone, we now, if you look at our map in Indiana, we're in the shrinking region with very few financial resources and not much to work with. And we're burdened with extra impacts from industry, former industry with brownfields, and infrastructure that we can't no longer afford because you don't have the population base to support it. Classic shrinking city scenario. So for the students, when we look at a lot of these sustainability concepts, why don't you pick a couple and help them understand in a region where we don't have the type of growth that Austin has or the Southeast, how some of these might start to apply to give them sort of a toehold as they work on this today. Was that, I tried to make you asked for a hard question, so I thought I'd oblige.
Well, you know, I could be a little bit flip and answer it this way. You start where you are. Our place, our center, has many, many more outrageous things than our city would ever dream of using. You have a situation where you have a building that triggered certain things from a solar standpoint. You use yourself as an example. You have Bob Kester working at the campus level to do things that many, many campuses would not even put on ballot or decisions related to provosts or whatever. David Orr just gave a lecture about what's going on at Oberlin. And David, in past years, has complained that his administration is not doing this and not doing that. So he became powerful enough and he began to change things enough that now the administration is listening. And they're doing a very, very exciting mixed-use development all around that trigger that McDonough did for them. So I think, how do you say that there are opportunities or not opportunities? You know, we have more work than we can handle at our shop. We're about to hire 4 people. The reason I think partially that has happened is that for some reason, number one, we've become very adaptable. We do policy, we do building, we do cutting-edge things that people are beginning to, they always are listening and wondering what we're doing. So that became, it creates a kind of a buzz. Now, that's us. Maybe we're so special. Maybe nobody in the whole world can duplicate us. Maybe Austin, Texas is, one of a kind. Maybe Crystal City and those crazy Mexican Americans down there that converted their town for a certain period of time to all renewables is an impossible situation. But somehow, when we started this, we would not have dreamt that something like the U.S. Green Building Council would exist. We would not have dreamt that there's 60,000, how many, Beth? How many lead professionals are in the U.S. at the moment? 35. I thought it was much more than that, but anyway. So there are businesses that are doing this kind of thing. In Austin, Texas, granted, I'm sorry, it's special. It's Austin, Texas. No other place like it on the planet. Has a very vibrant green building program. Now, other places in the country aren't doing this. Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit. Detroit is having a sort of inside-out renaissance beginning to happen doing these things with food. Unexpected ways of understanding urban sustainability are beginning to happen out of the absolute worst cases in the country. Some of the most downtrodden, auto-based conditions around. I don't know exactly what the solution is. I think that the solution probably is being a little bit outlandish. Proposing things that really cause commotion. Really ask questions that are not being asked. And to begin to get people doing projects that, when I first started the straw, and I'm not saying straw is something fantastic. In fact, there are certain people that I know of that have caused serious harm in that way of building. But if you're in the grassland, it's fascinating to me that there's an entire building system coming out of Dallas that's totally based on straw. It took 20 years to happen. The roof, the wall, the whole thing is pressed straw. The manufacturing facility just plugs itself onto the farm. Why isn't that happening here? I don't know. No, you're tied into economic development people. SBIR wants innovative industry, businesses to push the next level. That's how you get money from them. Yep.
I think one of the things, too, that hopefully we'll discover over the course of this week is that there are more of these things happening around us than we may realize. Pliny was talking about the fly ash cement a little earlier. Not very many people know that in northern Indiana we have a gypsum board plant that was actually built adjacent to the coal-fired power plant because it's basically mining that fly ash to make sheetrock rather than destroying established landscapes to clear and mine gypsum. So these things are happening. There are people producing fish in this region at a rate and intensity that would blow your loafers off. So there's a lot of these kind of things happening everywhere around the world. It's just that and around the country we just don't, the information doesn't flow perhaps well enough. Other questions?
Does anybody here have any kind of a sort of a entrepreneurial spirit? I'm part of about 5 businesses. Causes a lot of conflict with my nonprofit, but I just can't help it. Because a lot of this stuff is interesting stuff that could produce a lot of opportunity from an economic sense.
Yeah, you mentioned the purple pipe thing, which I'm admittedly not super familiar with. You were talking about dumping wastewater on the forests, though, and I think is that going through water treatment plants and treated, and then you're dumping the water onto the forest, or is there treatment happening in the soil itself rather than through the treatment plant? I wasn't clear on that.
Well, the dumping doesn't happen. The careful placement of these pipes at a certain level underneath the ground and a good irrigation system is basically the way it happens. But, you know, this is actually not very new technology. If I go back to the 60s and I go and look at Campbell's Soup in New Jersey, they were up against real problems with the state that early on with the amount of waste coming out of their manufacturing of soup plant. So they happened to have a large forest next to them, and they asked some biologist friend, you know, would this work? And so they started putting a little in, and they began to realize that the metabolism rate was significantly large, that they could take several acres. Now they were dumping. They were spraying into that forest and frankly destroying some of the forest with the spraying, because trees don't all like to be sprayed from top down. But the fact is that it worked. And if one began to look at the number of different technologies now out there with a little research and what part of the soil mantle is working on this, and I think the most important thing, though, is that you're beginning to get the landscape as an active participant in our metabolic existence. It's not just a pristine landscape the way I was taught 30 years ago. It's a landscape that has to be adroitly, with great knowledge, brought into being a part of the metabolics of how we live. There are lots of different, there are people doing this in the agroforestry arena. There are people doing this, so look up a group called Cascadia in the Pacific Northwest. They do a lot of tree farming that is basically fed by wastewater. I was working with them in China, and they showed unbelievable projects that they're doing. China is doing a tremendous amount with an agroforestry way of thinking, where the forest really is a food producer. To get landscapes understood, if you're going and creating new landscapes, that they can be in many, many ways food producers instead of just the typical way of thinking about how food is producing, in a kind of a manner that is anticipatory. It's sort of saying, you know, the world might go a little bit crazy, and that you're trying to bring in methods that begin to soften the landing, so to speak, of how we're going to begin to work with the future. And I think that there's a whole series of things in that wastewater field. Certainly John knows a bunch of them. Other people know. I think, what was his name? John Craddock has, you know, nationwide rewards for what he did along the White River. There should be a lot of that stuff going on. The thing that sort of is interesting to me, though, is that we sort of don't know the spectrum. We don't have our tool set together. We don't realize that there are 8 different ways of doing this. It doesn't have to be a wetland. It can be a forest. It can be this kind of forest. It can be that kind of forest. And so together you're beginning to say there's a whole set of possibilities that could be put into this idea of a working atlas that needs to be put out there. And that's what this project with the White River Corridor is about. Other questions? So I didn't go over lots of these. So we're going to continue on maybe this afternoon going through more of them if people want. 1 o'clock.
The mic got here. Yeah, I think Meg had a question.
I'm Meg Calkins, faculty in landscape architecture. Is it on? Okay. I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on protoscope. I'm not clear on that one.
You're kidding. Where we were as a part of a global pattern in 4 topic areas. How's the ecology working from planet to province to biome to ecozone to place? Were things improving for that particular topic within the ecosystem knowledge base? And these come out of clients that have, you know, needs. So they're saying, well, you know, if we're going to restore a grassland, how important is it? So we can actually go and show globally, in our part of the world, all the way down to that place, are things getting worse or are things getting better? So that a prototype begins to have some basis as to why it is that you're doing it. That happened in ecosystem analysis, that happened in hydrology, happens in soils and geology, and it happened in climatic systems. Then what we said is, what is our learning network? How can we use a variety of databases for the first time, but things like the Wiser Earth, to say, for that topic, on a global basis, can we learn in a similar place as to we are from others that have experience? Now, the interesting thing in some of these things, like protoscope, is that you couldn't even talk this way 10 years ago. Now you have the ability to get into this in a fairly robust way with good information behind it. So then we identify our proto-partners. Basically, it's our learning system. Divides itself up into basically these areas right here. Then the next thing that we do is that we actually say we have a proto-site, and then we actually look at that site as being representative of the local eco-zones in our place, and that the prototypes that we're doing on that proto-site relate to a much larger condition within our state, within our area. We have done this with a proto-city way of thinking, a proto-building way of thinking. So that is more or less what it's about, but if you go to our website, there are whole papers on it. So I'm asked to stop now.
We're gonna take a little bit of a break. We need to do some closure on this morning, and then we need to do a little bit on next steps for the students who are here and reorganizing for the afternoon. So I'd first like to ask all of you to thank yourselves, thank Pliny, thank our sponsors for this morning. And then if you could just give John a listen for a bit, he'll get us all straightened out.
And before I do that, I would like to just mention too that when Pliny talked earlier about the landscape architecture equivalent of LEED, sustainable sites, just to mention Meg Calkins, who is on the team that with the co-director of the center and others that did the developmental work on the Sustainable Sites Initiative. What we're going to do is at 1 o'clock, we'll pick up. We have a 1 o'clock session in AB 100. And the 1 o'clock session actually looks at each of the lenses and looks at the White River and begins to deal with the lenses as a way of understanding the White River. Now, each of you is on a team. We have 13 teams with 11 students per team. You might notice there are 11 panels up here. So at the end of the 2 o'clock lecture, you will meet with your team and identify of the 11 people who's going to work on which lens for the next day. There are revised schedules for the project on the corner bench over there. The teams that you're on is posted right above that. So we convene at 1 o'clock for your for Pliny's lecture in AB 100, and then immediately following that lecture, you will come back out here, meet briefly with your team in terms of long enough to identify what lens each person is going to work on, and then you'll reconstitute yourself into lens teams. Okay, so as you're listening to the lecture at 1 o'clock, be thinking about these lenses and whether there's a particular one that you would like to focus on intensely for the next day, because immediately following that lecture, that's what we'll be doing. Okay? Now, yes, Les. Okay. What we're also going to ask you to do is between now and 1 o'clock. Your team is listed up on the wall, and your team will have 2 tables to work on in this space beginning at 1 o'clock. So we will, between 11 and 1, we will organize the 13 paired tables in this space with about 10 chairs around each table, 10 or 11 chairs. Okay? So we have a request, volunteers, to reshape, reconfigure this space over the next 2 hours, and then we'll reconvene in AB 100 at 1 o'clock. Les? I think it definitely would. And as you do that, looking at the corridor, and look specifically, try to begin to see the structure of the river, the different kind of experiences, zones, strategies for engagement of the river, because the river actually does have very many personalities. And I will close this session with just a note that when we were talking earlier about the special kinds of things that happen in each regions, I think most people around Muncie don't really realize the significance of the White River through Muncie, because I know I was part of a think tank at the center back in the early 90s when the center was identifying, baselining what it meant to be sustainable in the U.S. And one of the best examples, if not the best example, of sustainability as we deal with our water resources was what happened in the White River in Muncie in the early 70s, where the water was converted, the river was converted very reasonably quickly from a chemical sewer for industrial plants into a regenerating river. So we're actually working with a project that has already had one major emergence and from one phase to another, and we're looking at facilitating the next step forward on that this week. The chairs will stay here. You can just temporarily fold some of them up as you move tables in, but we have 150 chairs in here now. When you get through, we should have the table setups and almost as many chairs clustered around each of the tables. We'll be able to expand out a bit to do that. We'll be able to capture all this space up here as well. The tables are on the bridge. And Nathaniel, all the tables are on a cart. He'll just roll the cart out here into the space. Thank you.